Welcome. You're listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lori Lee Benstock, host of a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network and anywhere you get your podcasts. Today's guest is Dr. Jamie Huysman, founder of the now Survivors of Toxic Abuse Relationship Network, or STAR Network. It's a 501c3 charity dedicated to bringing worldwide awareness and treatment to those whose emotional reality has been distorted by narcissistic abuse. You may have recognized Dr. Jamie. He has been on the show a couple of times before, and we do love having his expertise. You know, he has developed Celebrity Foundation, serving millions. His trauma-informed clinical background has driven his passion to deal with this public health disaster in honor of his child and all children. He currently leads the weekly support groups TAR Anon that you may see popping up on my feeds that are free for anyone in toxic abuse relationships. Dr. Jamie, thank you so much for joining me again.
Oh, I so enjoy these sessions between you and I. I think we're so in sync. It's like being on the surfboard. So, Laura, thank you, an authentic insider.
Well, thank you. And, you know, I love that you are actually going to be providing, you know, our blog to Authentic Insider magazine and focusing on authentic parenting, which is what we were going to focus today. But I do want to talk about STAR Network really quickly because you were TAR Network and now you're STAR Network. Kind of talk a little bit about that and what you guys are doing, especially, you know, when in dealing with parents and children and authentic parenting.
Well, listen, I can't thank you enough for allowing us to actually give an update to the public out there. I'll do it brief. We don't need to get deep because I really want to dive deep into the neuro parenting piece, which is what you and I both kind of connect over. And so I think the whole world will be connecting over. So just for anybody who doesn't know the STAR Network, we have 3 pillars of part of our mission. And that is, the first one is support, which we're now dealing with through TAR Anon, which is a 12-step, basically a way to take your life back. Trauma is taking your life back, working steps like radical acceptance, self-compassion, and doing it with people all around you, co-regulated people we call a family of choice that allows you to start really recovering in your life. And that's TAR Anon. We also have the treatment side and the STAR side, the socially responsible side, where we're working with content creators, YouTubers. We have obviously Richard Grannon, who's an amazing force of nature as our international ambassador. And we're placing the STAR as basically a triggering thing for all the YouTubers and content creators who are speaking to us, because we know people are being triggered left and right. And we love the awareness that these subject matter experts are bringing. But just like my work in television in the 90s, is great liability. So we have free resources for suicide ideations. And we also have free ways to get to our virtual trauma network, TAR Anon. But the third part, which I think this podcast is really what is going to encompass, is what mine, Mila, our entire team's North Star, which is the prevention piece of attachment disorders and narcissistic abuse. I mean, let's face it, you know, no matter what, we do need support after going through a toxic relationship. Our brains are cognitively fogged. Our whole worlds have been turned upside down. Many people are suicidal. They don't know where to go. It's an isolating event. And TAR Anon does that. It allows us to reparent our brains, literally the neuroplasticity, to get what we didn't get, because this is a childhood trauma issue and nothing triggers childhood trauma CPTSD more than narcissistic abuse. So, but what do we really do to get in front of this in terms of prevention? You know, I'm not going to change one toxic, narcissistic, or borderline or histrionic person as a psychologist in this lifetime. But our program, which we call our OASIS program, and OASIS is used because it's real, but unfortunately childhood trauma images that have us love and connect with people are mirages. That's really going to be our North Star. So we're looking to scale neuroparenting, our OASIS parenting, in obstetric unit hospitals everywhere around this country and around the world, to teach parents, listen, how to actually raise a child. Because I have deep compassion for toxic individuals. They didn't choose to be evil. They didn't want to be evil. They probably wanted empathy. They wanted to be accountable. They wanted to be, non-transactional and love. But they're frozen literally at 5 years old as an attachment disorder. So we felt our prevention programs will allow parents to learn how actually to raise a child properly so you're not creating Frankenstein, if you will.
It's so funny because, when you're pregnant, you have all these books about, how to be pregnant, but no books on how to raise a child. Well, there are some, but I feel like it's not emphasized enough. And, as someone who, is as trauma survivor, I feel like there was a point in my child's life that there was some damage done, just me being very reactive, and now it's trying to undo all of that while as I'm healing and working on that, raising a child. And you talked about neuro parenting, and I think that kind of goes along the same line of authentic parenting. And so, could you actually describe what is neuro parenting?
I can. It's a newer concept, obviously. You see, and let me say it parallels the world of psychology. So I am more of a Jungian therapist. I worked for years in the psychotherapeutic, psychoanalytic world. Patients would come to see me. I worked on the premise of Carl Jung, which I still think is, a god of psychology. And I still use a lot of his work and shadow work and experiential work. But psychology has been shifting over the past 30 years. Okay, we've gone from that emotional flashback, what happened at 10 years old with your mom or dad, to the place where we understand, the world of trauma much more, and how to retrain our brains, and how literally we can actually deal with the concept of neuroplasticity, and how we have a second bite of the apple. I find your honest, authentic, sort of vulnerable sort of conversation here and talking about, well, maybe I did something wrong or I did something right. Well, I'm a psychologist. I got 35 years of clinical training, but I'm a dad too. And believe me, I'm in the same boat as you. I mean, these are what I call very much innocent abuses of some sort, right? And what we normally do as a society in generations, and it's particularly sort of challenging in other cultures, but in ours, is we keep recreating the family trauma and never intervening on it, because chances are your parents probably raised you the way their parents raised them, without the understanding and awareness of that wasn't the proper way. My parents, I'm sure, had the best intentions in the world, but I think they used Dr. Spock. And when you look at Dr. Spock and the abuses, the innocent abuses, and the things he called for in the book, that was an absolute hideous way of raising a child too. And then you mix this with two people in a marriage or in a partnership who are arguing and fighting and really not connecting well. And all of a sudden we see that the first 5 years of a child's life, which is the blank slate, which is literally the most receptive, vulnerable time when they're developing a healthy view of the world or a not so healthy view of the world, where they're developing the fight, flight, freeze response, which is really protection, if you will, from what they're watching. Or now let's get into the fourth F, which is not biological, the fawn response, which I'd love for your listeners to go get Pete Walker's book about how to thrive, not just survive a CPTSD, because we have confused codependency, which we knew 20, 30, 40 years ago, with really the fawn response. And personally, I'll just throw myself on the sword here. I, too, as a psychologist, went through a toxic relationship many years ago, and I've been in recovery for codependency. But until I really had to look at what was happening those first, 8 years of life, the concept is it takes 8 years to really develop who we are and 80 to get out. My gosh, I could never recover in reparenting. So to answer your question about neuroparenting, okay, we have really raised kids with invisible wounds. What we've done as parents is understand we've done probably operant conditioning, which is Skinnerian. I don't want to get too deep here, but it's really the token economy. It's the positive reinforcement, the negative reinforcement. Okay. It's sometimes giving you the iPad when okay, and taking the iPad away when you're not, or the phone or timeouts, or we think that literally operant conditioning is literally the best parenting. Well, no one's told us that it's absolutely the most hideous and worst parenting. Operant conditioning, Skinnerian conditioning, only works in two modalities, in prisons and in the military. And that's because they have very, very organized, very strict boundary sort of systems. So if you're getting a good thing one day, you're probably going to get a good thing next day. But parents, myself included, cannot be the gold standard of parenting, which is being fair, consistent, and available all the time. So by going back and forth with the child, we're creating what's called the trauma bond in childhood. Okay. So we deal with toxic relationships later where we meet a toxic individual and we get trauma bonded and it feels normal. Well, of course it's going to feel normal because in our childhood, that was our first experience with the trauma bond, with a very toxic sort of relationship. And we probably came out of that looking at ourselves in a way that we never saw a healthy relationship. So formally, psychology would have you come see me and let's talk about what happened at 10 years old. It's a pretty cerebral process. But the trauma model, now that we see that you can actually reparent the brain, is entirely different. So when you say, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm doing with my kid, maybe I did this, I'd say the same thing too. The child's brain is very resilient and very, very malleable. And I used to run adolescent treatment centers. And even in adolescence, I could get kids to change the brain. But what neuroparenting needs to do is to be there to show people and prevention that the proper way to literally raise a child is first to raise the child within you. Your damaged self is really what's parenting that child. And we always say that hurt people hurt people. So at TAR Anon and anywhere where a person can recover from complex trauma and reparent themselves personally, it's a way of showing the child in an attractive model, in a safe model, in a place where the child can really model as a corrective experience what dad and mom are doing, which is to create neurosafety in themselves so that their child is not walking on eggshells, doesn't really have to deal with the inconsistency of I'm getting this one day and that day. They are feeling a safe system. And then we have value conversations with our children as soon as they go off the track. So in so many ways, neuroparenting is modeling psychology now and modeling the trauma model. So I sit on the advisory board with the Complex PTSD Foundation and Polyvagal Institute. So the Gabor Mates, Bessel van der Kolk, Stephen Porges, this way, the authentic child that could never be authentic now can start being authentic if their parents are raising them in a neuro proper way, which is raising themselves and keeping an environment that literally allows our child to feel safe and value-based in making decisions and not being placed in timeouts and not having iPads removed and not saying you can do this one day or not. So kind of a long-winded way of saying we've gotten parenting pretty damn wrong over the times. And we all think it was the operant conditioning, our child, we're going to condition their mind. No, we're conditioning our minds to create invisible wounds, which would leave indelible sort of marks on our developing brain. Okay. And those scars are the scars that later on we need to reparent.
It's interesting you brought up that whole example of the iPad because, while I didn't have an iPad as a child growing up because that didn't exist, but I was getting things taken away, whenever I was doing something wrong. And, I learned to do the same thing with my children. And I didn't even know it was wrong until my husband pointed out, we can't do that. And I'm like, but why? This is, not saying it like, and then, he kind of looked at me like, did your parents really know what they were doing? But, it's interesting, but what if you don't even know what is right and what is wrong? I'm glad you're creating this example right here because I don't feel like a lot of people know that. Because I only know because my husband that's a very hard line for him. Let's try not to do that.
Isn't it amazing, Laura, the values and emphasis and priorities we place on a culture that you either pay now with that child or you pay later? Mm-hmm. Like take the Adverse Childhood Experience Studies by Kaiser Permanente, and everybody should go to cdc.gov and take a look at them. If you have 4 or greater adverse childhood experiences, okay, you're more likely to be in jail or rehab or have 10 years shortened life. Literally, it's clear. Studies are 20 years, longitudinal studies. I'm now training our doctors on this, not like Gabor says, instead of saying what's wrong with you, to ask a patient what happened to you so you can get in front of it. So your husband, intuitively in this way, I'm glad that you are able to go back and forth with him because, sadly, we don't understand complex PTSD, childhood trauma. And I tell people, don't go clinical, just think of it as that. Because literally 2/3 of children probably have almost 4 indicators of adverse childhood experiences. And so those scars are being created on an ongoing manner when literally taking that away, giving the child, taking away, is only creating ways to them to either game the system, not trust the primary caregivers around them because one day they'll be consistent and not, and showing that the world is not such a safe place. And so literally authenticity, which is really the goal of recovery from complex trauma, is denied to the child while their developing brain, which I call it really a delicate dance of growth and vulnerability, is happening. Okay. Imagine the brain, literally as a blank slate, and that we're just building neurons, and they're getting the first look, if you will, at what life can be like. And then they find out that life one day can be like this. Oh no, you get the food. The other day you get starved. And the brain develops in stages. So we haven't really understood well the in utero trauma. Kids get born obviously in 9 months in their mother's womb. My daughter, was a preemie and had 8 months. But man, let me tell you real quickly about the co-regulation of childbirth. And you as a mom would know this well. So the child has the fluid, the amniotic fluid all around them. They feel safe. They feel great. It's been 8 months of calmness, and bingo, they come out at 2 a.m. in a all lights, camera action. The obstetrician, the OB, is probably not even the same OB that worked with you for 8-9 months because they send somebody else in. So much for co-regulation between the mother and the doctor. So they're scared to death. Okay. Then they slap them on the rear end. We cut the umbilical cord. I did. I was scared to death. And they cry like a baby. And then from that day on, they really don't honor, neither does the society around them, their neurological system. So they're not ever embracing it. So life becomes more like that, very much random, very inconsistent. Yet we collectively are not teaching our children or ourselves, which is more important, the child within us that really then attracts our child, of how to be consistent, how to be fair, how to be available. All three are the cardinal sort of principles of good parenting.
Wow. Well, what is a good example on, I want my child to behave, but they want to do other things.
I've got a good example for you, and I will not mention names because I can't breach confidentiality. So I had a couple, very briefly. They didn't know about parenting. Listen, by the way, when my last charity, the 501c3 Lisa Gibbons Memory Foundation, we didn't know anything about caregiving. We still don't. And there's 90 million caregivers that are doing $400 billion of care. So between caregiving and parenting, neither are being really trained properly in this country. And they're probably the most significant events that are affecting people every day. But let me go back to the couple here. So the mom, she was fairly dysregulated. I would say she had a couple of adverse childhood experiences. I don't think she was raised in any way possible in a fair, consistent, available way. I think her father was a despot. He would isolate them and go off and punish them, and there was no communication. So she was really not regulated. She was, in fact, very dysregulated. The father was at work all the time, going back and trying to go back and forth. The mom was left with the child. One day the father comes home. Here's a great example. Mom is trying to breastfeed the child, right? Now, mom's dysregulated. She takes everything personal, though she thinks that the world has abandoned her. The child does not drink the milk from the mother's breast. The child starts rejecting mom for some particular reason. It's a child. She doesn't know what's going on, The mom took it so personally. This is the historian, was the father in the couples counseling. He said, mom took the child, put her down very forcefully on the bed, left her on the bed to cry. And the mom ran out of the room saying, my daughter doesn't love me. My daughter's rejecting me. She doesn't want my milk. Now, listen to that. Now, think about it now, experientially from that child, that little tiny child's perspective, laying on the bed. Mom is abandoned. She's already screamed, you don't like me. Father definitely is not there to protect in some particular way. And think about then the child, which has a blank slate of a brain, already seeing how unsafe the world is. Or in the fawn response, what I have to do to get mama's love and attention. So there's an example clinically of one particular case out of millions that in that moment, in that instant, that child was being formed, that brain of distrust, dysregulation, and how I need to change my authentic self as a crying child in need of proper caregiving to conform to my dysfunctional mom who's so dysregulated. She threw me on the bed and abandoned me. Think about that for a moment.
Well, how do we undo the damage? If we decide midway, that's an infant now, the child is 5, mom realizes something she has suffered from trauma, she starts her healing process. How do you undo the damage that has already been done?
Well, that always begins with the mom. Now, if the mom is toxic, and I say this, has 5 indicators or greater and can be diagnosed in as a personality disorder. It's borderline histrionic, a narcissistic personality disorder, and antisocial. We call them the relationship disorders. We have a much more difficult time then. 1 out of 8 people, the APA says, has a personality disorder, and they impact in this culture. And this is why we have the STAR network, 250 million people, whether it's intimate partners, LGBTQ plus, toxic work sites, high conflict caregiving. It's everywhere. Your boss at work. So if the mom or dad, either one, doesn't matter, has those indicators, we've got a problem. They have no empathy, no accountability. They see life as transactional and unsafe. That probably has been like that since 5 years old. Most people aren't like that. We're saying it's 1 out of 8. So I think a mom or a dad, first step is to reparent themselves. Let's face it, the neurobiology of their brain has been so wired poorly that they have to now start rewiring it properly. So the first step is obviously always, beginning with yourself. To know oneself is to know the world. So in this therapy with a good licensed trauma therapist or getting into TAR Anon and working with other people, they're going to start realizing that they're probably very dysregulated, very much doing what mom or dad had done prior with them, and start realizing that they can't tell people to get well. They can't tell their child, don't do this. They have to actually be the oasis of attraction. And so literally we have to be, like Gandhi said, the change we want to see in the child. Because the brain is vulnerable, certainly in childhood. But we often say childhood roles don't work in adulthood. So listen, I work in a large corporation and I work with 35,000 employees. And my boss says, how do you approach our employees? And I said, I approach our employees like they're 8 years old, never had therapy. I said, because at some point in time, nobody comes and sees their therapist. They see their hairdresser, they tell their traumas and problems to them. And I think without them having therapy, I can know they've got a fight, flight, freeze response and a fawn response that's being triggered. And so all I do is I give them a trauma-informed program of how they can reparent themselves, create a family of choice in a clinic. And the brain's vulnerable region, it works. It works. The brain works well. I don't want to get into a whole study, but the brain stem is where the quick action happens. And then the amygdala gets flooded, let's say at work, or that mom that you said, what do we do? And then her prefrontal cortex, which is reasoning, gets shut down. Well, when she starts emotionally regulating, when she starts feeling her body in a trauma recovery way, she'll start doing the Pilates, the yoga, the breath work. She will go with support groups or create safe relationships with others. And so she can retrain her brain. Now, we are losing a generation, I do believe, and that's why we believe, I have Mila and a lot of people that hopefully will take this over the line years from now. But that's why our neuroparenting piece is so critical. Exactly. If we can prevent that from happening, it's great. But intervention is we can change our brains. And neuroplasticity does work. And I've seen it with adolescents, which are much easier. But today I'm seeing it with adults, boomers, and seniors. So it starts with us. We do need awareness and then be able to transform and find our own self-love before we actually get into relationships, or actually before we should become parents.
Definitely. I wish I knew that years ago. But, as parents who are trauma survivors, we need trauma-informed care. But how do we parent in a trauma-informed, way?
That's it. The trauma-informed way of parenting is, how would you have liked to have been parent as a child, Laura Lee, right? If you could go back to that baby that was, now I'm not saying it's metaphorical, that was laying on the bed that was rejected because she wouldn't take the mother's milk, which then made the mother feel more abandoned in some way. How would you want if you were that child? Well, you'd want your parents to offer fair consistency and availability, not to keep saying and parroting the words love. I mean, I go into court a lot and I see people, men and women, say, I love you, my child. I love you, my child. But I'm there testifying because there's 2 or 3 felonies there. Love is very misconstrued, okay? Especially also culturally. We can get into this in different areas. It's misconstrued. Parenting is 3 things. It's being fair, it's being consistent, and it's being available. So how would you have really wanted yourself at that moment if you didn't take your mother's milk to be treated? Well, you'd want your mother to hold you. You want your mother to say that you're crying because we're having a little difficult time communicating here, and slowly but surely we need to meet each other halfway. You would ask mom, please don't throw me on that bed and leave me alone in here and show me how unsafe the world is. Gabor Mate would say, look, a child will scream at 2 years old for a cookie and not stop screaming for a cookie. And so parents maybe put their child in timeout. Maybe they'll scream at them. Maybe they'll say it's not appropriate. Well, what does a child want? The child wants to be held, hugged, screamed in mama or daddy's hands, have a primary caregiver that says, look, the cookie's great, but it's not good right before dinner. But I'm going to hold you and I'm going to be here for you through the process until we understand it together. It is a neuro-regulated way, first with ourselves and then with our child. And these are the principles and these are the things that are not being taught either on hospital units, in schools, or anywhere humans are. And it's the experiential path, by the way, Laura Lee. You cannot read your way into neuroparenting. Like Nike, the goddess of victory, says, you got to just do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you can't really be able to regulate your child. Like I can't imagine if I'm dysregulated wanting to hold my child. That sounds terrible, but that's what the work we do is for, right? We get the help. So what is Star Network doing to help parents and children? You know, it's a trickle down effect.
Well, I'm an old social worker. Okay. So everything we do now is pretty cutting edge. What was old is actually new, even though the trauma model, and we do see really new interventions around reparenting ourselves are working. We also know as social workers that we're not just going to work with the protagonist or the person. Let's say it's a domestic abuse woman in a shelter, that at the same time, we're going to make sure that we have TAR Anon, which is 12 steps and a peer-to-peer trauma network that now we're virtually actually taking to war zones and other places. We're going to also intervene on the child and give them a peer-to-peer place where they can learn to impact their own emotional regulation, talk to other healthy kids or kids who are struggling in the right direction, like AA or NA. So we've got a family systems model. We're going to be in one particular war zone, we believe, in 60 days. And they're saying, we'll treat the soldier who's got PTSD. Well, I think we should also be treating the 2 kids and the partner, because the incidence of abuse in that particular country has skyrocketed. Why? Because it's a family systems issue. So what we're doing with TAR Anon is we're bringing it both to the parents, but we're also bringing it to the children. Take parental alienation, which is a byproduct of toxic relationships. If you actually, as a person going through hell in a divorce with a toxic individual, are watching your child being alienated, what if that child also was in a healing group with other people, realizing that probably they're being gaslit and being destroyed? So I think what we need to say at the Star Network is we're not just supporting people in the present, because again, it all begins with ourselves. And what we're seeing is magic happening. I'm not a therapist in our group. I am strictly what we call the TAR mentor. I am also a STAR, survivor of toxic abuse relationships. But we're getting, Mila, myself, our whole team are getting amazing things. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to set boundaries. Thank you for allowing me to know I was worth it to leave that relationship that I was being abused at. So if also parents are listening to this right now, this poop show of watching 2 parents who are literally in constant psychological war, understand the one premise where you keep saying we're going to stay together for the kids. That may be the worst thing you could humanly possibly do. Why? Neuroparenting in a divorced household works well. Why? If one person is highly dysregulated, let's say the mom that threw the child into the bed, Okay. And she maybe has not, or this could be a male too. Don't get me wrong. This is a male female thing. It doesn't matter. It's clinical. But if actually it's that person really who did it threw that person on the bed, literally could learn, could have a TAR network, that's great. If they're not capable of it, okay, and the other parent, let's say, who may be having the child alienated from them, is just a half healthy, neurotic, connective force, but is fair, consistent, and available with their child. Well, guess what? They get to mitigate in that divorce the other parent's inability to raise the child. Why is that important? Because I think all humans gravitate towards neurosafety. We allow our bodies to make our decisions, not our minds. And I believe over time, a child who may be in a parenting agreement 50-50, may be in a dysregulated environment half the time, and in a neurosafe the other half the time, will start choosing and gravitating to the alternative and learn that there are two alternative paths. That's why I say to people, if you're staying together in a poop show for your kid, that is even more child abuse, because the childhood trauma is being watched. They're never learning what a healthy relationship is. They have no idea that if one person can neuroparent, deal with values, and deal in an attraction manner, in a safety manner, that can work. Okay. So I just want to tell you that there's really hope here, though. I don't want everybody to walk away saying it's a done deal. I think the brain is remarkable in terms of its neuroplasticity and its ability to change and adapt. So I think healing is extraordinarily is possible. Now, I know how great of a mom you are. So,
I have my days. I have my days.
We all do. But in adolescence, okay, we still have a second bite of the apple. The hormones are changing, the puberty's there. You get healthy, safe kids, and you start working in trauma-informed ways. And I would like everybody to understand. Run out and get you a good darn therapist, period. And make sure that that therapist is certified in trauma and trained in DBT, Dialectical Behavioral Therapy, or IFS, Internal Family Systems. This is the new frontier for healthy parenting. Why? It'll teach us how to parent ourselves. And so you can do this. This is a shameless promotion, but I don't make any dollars off it. But I do think the best search engine out there is Psychology Today. And on the front, they have search for a therapist. And I think if you hear this and put your zip code in, out will pop 5 or 10 very vetted, licensed people. Make sure they are trauma certified. Make sure they do, techniques like EMDR, experiential work, DBT, and to go to them, because then you start reparenting yourself. You start learning in an experiential way a lot, and you start actually being able to practice the brain's ability to form new connections, which is neuroplasticity, and raise your child. And that is how we can raise a child healthy, whether the parents together are doing this or whether parents are apart. And unfortunately, the byproduct of toxic relationships are, hell and damnation, flying monkeys and alienation. But there is a shot of showing a child the oasis of authenticity.
Because I find that very interesting when, I think there are a lot of people who stay in marriages, like you were saying, because, they're doing it for the children, but it's a very toxic relationship. So it's very unhealthy for the child. But I think the other fear is, well, if we do get a divorce, I don't know what's going to happen there, but you control what you can control. Right. And so that seeing even half that time is helpful.
You do. Yeah, and boundaries are critical, and boundaries, and we don't learn that. A lot of people that get caught in toxic relationships are empaths, codependents. Maybe even though I was in recovery for 32 years, it's like us, and so we become fair game, realizing that that's also transactional. Codependency is also transactional, but I also believe that the important part about all this is our awareness that literally our brain. It's got neural pathways. Our brain needs reparenting. And if our child is young like yours, it's wonderful, right? Because we do have a shot of really going back to neuroplasticity, creating neurosafety, and having a corrective experience. Then, as I ran adolescent treatment centers, even in adolescence, as I said, the brain goes through a process, of pruning, adolescent, whatever, hormone development, but we still have the ability to retrain our brain to neural pathways. Now, we have to train the family, again, family systems at the same time. where the child will relapse and go back to that old model. But understand that there in childhood, we have a great opportunity to parent properly or to learn about this. Adolescence, we still have one. I call it sharpening the pencil there. As adults, then we need to get also in places like TAR Anon and understand the awareness that our life ain't working too well. And why is that? Well, we're probably using the child role, the codependent or the fawning response or whatever it is. And by the way, these have huge medical sort of complications, Laura Lee. Your mind is not just doing this in the absence of the body. The mind is happening, but the body is, as Bessel says, keeping the score. Right. So you can get very sick if you let untreated, trauma or complex trauma continue. So this is great for your medical health, neuroparenting, and great, obviously, for the psychological health. The mind and body are inextricably bound up.
Wow. Well, that's amazing information. And yes, I do feel that parenting myself has also helped. My son is much younger, and so he kind of got the benefits of my healing. I feel like with my daughter, I'm still reworking what was done, any damage that was done. But my son seems to be adapting very well to my new, breath work and healing and all of that. But because my daughter is older and she was with me more when I was still dealing with the trauma, I do think she struggles with a little anxiety and probably PTSD from that. So I'm wondering, what can, I guess it all boils down to keep healing, but is there any way of addressing it?
Yeah, I think it's great ways. I can't be the therapist to my child. I would love to be. I try to raise her in an EQ way that, I go to my therapist at 2:00 on Tuesdays. She knows she's a trauma therapist because I tell her about it. And then I have her. She's very open to therapy. I think the beauty of the new generation is not like that old shame and stigma. They actually do believe in it. So she has her own. And I think we all should understand that the brain is very remarkable in terms of its plasticity. But I would be very proactive. Prevention is really critical. That's why at Star Network, this is our North Star. I was saying last night in our meeting that when you're feeling okay, or when you're obviously in crisis, either way, and doing this work, you're depositing in your bank account, in your mind, resilience. Okay. So the resilience you're banking in your mind, because that's all complex trauma recovery is the breath work when I'm feeling stressed, Pilates, yoga, hanging around healthy people. So I call it at my company, this is resiliency development. So when you're developing it, I think the brain is pretty darn remarkable. And the kids will feel it. And everybody around you will feel it, that you become a safer process. And also they'll emulate it. So I think you can do a whole lot. I think you get kids with healthy kids. I don't micromanage my child. I do the due diligence on the kids she's hanging with. I do believe that co-regulation through healthy kids, my child's 13, is much more effective in terms of raising her self-esteem and giving her the ability to have high EQ and to become a leader, more than her mom or me telling her what to do. It just doesn't work that way. We get psychological reactants and run. You really need to foster that. And I think the journey of healing from childhood trauma, and I really want everybody to take this one home with them, it's not easy, but it's powerful. It's a journey so worth taking, because every step, I think, goes towards understanding and addressing the neurological impacts in our trauma. It goes back and looks at our generational issues of what we keep passing on. So I think it's a call to action. One of the things you just mentioned, I think things like our criminal justice systems, our school systems, everywhere needs to be trauma informed. This is no longer your daddy's psychology anymore. This is now an empowering process where parents, get a good licensed trauma therapist. It's always good to have a coach, but you can actually be your own trauma therapist. You can be very helpful. And we call it take your child to the TAR dojo, let them to learn how to neuroregulate themselves and make sure they're around healthy, safe people. So I think we all have a very collective, social responsible sort of role in creating trauma-informed systems, which we've done every May now. We're very much cognizant, it's Mental Health Awareness Month, of getting this country, trauma-informed. But the prevention piece of the North Star of Oasis parenting programs, to me, that's the least we can do. I think we're very resilient. I just think parents had no clue. And so I'm going to give grace and compassion to many, not those that crossed the line that I have to testify against, and just say you probably were doing what others were doing. But hell, if you do not break that family trauma, as we say at the Star Network, the family trauma will definitely break you. So beginning now to understand what neuroparenting is instead of co-parenting, or instead of even parenting with a highly dysregulated individual that you're fighting with, or counter-parenting, which is just more alienation. We need to create safety in ourselves, neurosafety, which is trauma recovery, coming to TAR Anon, making sure that we are putting our parenting of ourselves first, and literally paying this forward. And that's why we'd love everybody to come to the Star Network. I mean, we're a 501c3. I would love you to be there to spearhead our advisory board for neuroparenting as we scale this out. We're looking for organizations to come and to start scaling TAR Anon around the world and start scaling our Parenting Oasis program, and also helping this world become much more trauma informed. Because if we do that, we will literally be contributing to peace on earth. And we literally will be leaving a legacy to our children of a much safer, less toxic world.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine if everyone was able to heal their own trauma? Oh, incredible work. Dr. Jamie, is there anything else that you would like to add?
Well, I just like to add to everybody that it is in our hands. It's in our choices. We do get that fatalistic sort of screw it. I can't do it. It's too far gone. Oh my gosh, my parents raised me this way. No, come to TAR Anon. Come to TAR Anon, where you have 80, 100 people a night, literally reparenting themselves, understanding that they may have come from a toxic parenting situation or a toxic partner, or how that impacts their child within and their children, because they become aware. And all we need to do is become aware, as we say at the Star Network. And what Freud says, once you're aware, you're no longer naive. You have to transform. Whether it's AA or NA or CODA, it's also now TAR Anon. And those groups are free. They're virtual. They're rolling around the world right now. If you're an organization listening to us, please come and allow us. It's a stab at creating the awareness, transformation. And guess what? The byproduct of all that is self-love. And the byproduct of self-love, especially if you talk to Carl Jung, is what? Collective love. So it's all within our hands, but we ourselves have to be the change, and we have to start reparenting ourselves first for all this to occur.
Oh, thank you so much, because I know that there are so many parents who just don't have a clue. And there's some parents who are like, okay, maybe, let's look at ACEs. Let's check that out, make sure you know.
Yeah. And let me leave you with one really positive, upbeat sort of way. Hope does spring eternal. I worked with that family, where that woman threw that child on that bed and cried and created that unfortunate, terrible scar of distrust in the child. Well, that child today is 15 years old.
Wow.
That woman has continued in therapy, done strong dialectical behavioral therapy, which is Marsha Linehan's, for attachment issues. The father and her have been in therapy. I saw the child recently, and I think the child was very grounded, very powerful. And it was a corrective emotional experience, because they all participated in what? Raising themselves, learning, becoming aware. And obviously that level of attraction with their child, the child did it as well. So that poor child that was laying there, she's doing pretty damn good right now. She got pretty good high EQ. And so hope springs eternal. So please do not give up. Today could be the first day of the rest of your life and the rest of your parenting life, both for yourself and your kid.
Amazing. Oh, thank you so much for joining me today. I love having you on. It's just such a gift having you on with all your wisdom.